Tennessee, and the author of Old Money, New South, The Spirit of Chattanooga, America's Trail of Tears, A Story of Love and Betrayal, and the most recent, Hillary and Vince, A Story of Love, Death, and Cover-Up, which is the primary topic of our conversation tonight. You've written this book, Hillary and Vince. Of course, this was, 23 years ago, July 20th, 1993.
Yeah, very good.
So here we are, more than 2 decades after the fact. Why is this strange death still relevant today?
Well, the obvious one is that Hillary Clinton is about to become president of the United States, or possibly. And she certainly is deeply tied into whatever happened to Vince Foster. He was her close friend. Some say her best friend. They were lovers. And then he had this mysterious death. We don't know why he died. There's immense amount of cover-up that she certainly played a part in. So you want to just, you want to vet any presidential candidate, so that's the obvious reason. Secondly, I would say it's relevant because it provides a nice micro example of just how corrupt federal officials can be on the ground, at the very, primary level. So the people who saw Vince Foster's body, the people who first reported, the 2 or 3 FBI agents who pretty much handled the thing from soup to nuts, and a couple others. It doesn't take too many, and that's one of the reasons why, these conspiracies can be pulled off. But they were highly corrupt, and I document in my book the lies, the falsifications, where they add things into the record whole cloth, where people and witnesses say things and they delete it from the record, where they plant evidence, falsify, the gun. They wipe the gun clean from the prints. I mean, we go on and on and on in the book, but I think that's an interesting thing to learn on a micro level. You hear generalizations. The FBI is corrupt. The CIA is corrupt. The federal government, and people sort of hear that. But when you tell us a specific story, Vince Foster died, and the first witnesses on the scene saw no gun. The second witnesses on the scene saw a 9mm square large gun. And the third people on the scene, or the FBI said the official gun on the scene later, was a .38 caliber revolver, which was completely different from the other two. And so when you talk about that, now you got a specific story where you've got a real liar, and it kind of makes you raise your eyebrow. And so I think those specific stories are important. Now, one kind of interesting thing to note is that the main FBI agent on the scene for this incident, his name was Larry Monroe, was also the main spokesman for the FBI for the Oklahoma City bombing. So these characters keep cropping up again and again and again. And so it doesn't take too many of them. You could have 5 or 10 of these guys who are just corrupt to the core and willing to lie and do whatever they need to do. And they're just kind of hands-on these various things that come up. And a lot of deceit and a lot of injury and harm can be done to the American people. And I think, this is what happens with these events now that we're dealing with, whether it's Orlando or Dallas or, yada, yada. Immediately, the feds get jurisdiction. And so anything that the media reports to us, they just get it straight from the feds, and they're like little lapdogs. They'll just take whatever is handed to them, and they just accept it, and they don't investigate it. They don't even have the ability to investigate it. It's all sealed off, and and no one can do anything. So this book is yet another example of how that happens. I think it's always good to be reminded of that.
That's an interesting point. This is the closed loop that's established. I think Patrick Henningsen at 21st Century Wire gives a good rundown on how that's done. They immediately call it a terror event as opposed to like a local act of crime, criminal, act of crime, which would mean that local authorities.
You got the coroner coming in and the medical examiner coming in, and you got the local police and the detectives and all these, constitutional offices need to come in and actually deal with it. And these are people you know and trust, and these are people you've elected in office, and these are people that you can somewhat vouch for their credibility.
Yeah.
Now we just got a bunch of spooks in the Pentagon.
With no accountability to the public, really.
Right.
Essentially, yeah. And again, what happens with some of these events, and this again, it is the Foster case again is a good microcosm or an example of how these things can be controlled by relatively few people, because you're dealing with top-down, command control situations like the FBI, where people just follow orders and they're not going to buck the system because a lot can be done to them. Whistleblowers aren't treated very well in this country. So yeah, it's very easy to control if you have key people controlling the investigation, especially when you federalize it, which seems to be almost automatic these days, without any regard for, for jurisdiction, states' rights, or federalism. Anything, it's just automatic.
Yeah. The third answer for your question is why is this book relevant? A good part of the story, I trace the saga of the first witness on the scene. He probably was the first witness on the scene. It's disputable, but his name's Patrick Knowlton, and he came to the park. He needed to take a leak, and he gets out and he sees this very sinister man staring at him, and kind of gave him this get the hell out of here look, or something may happen to you. But he had to go so bad that he just kind of tentatively crept over to where he could do what he needed to do. Yeah, and he noticed, what kind of car was next to this guy, which was a light brown early 80s Honda. And that was about it. He was glad when he finally left that nothing had happened to him. And then he gets home and he hears that the Clintons' good friend, White House counsel Vince Foster, had been found that night dead in the park and by gunshot. And so he talks to his girlfriend about it. He wasn't even going to remember the whole incident until that happened, when he heard that on the evening news. He tells his girlfriend, he's like, well, she convinces him he needs to call the park police or tell somebody. So he makes a phone call that evening, and the official he talked to just didn't sound interested at all, and that was it. And the next morning, his conscience got to him. He says, I got to really talk to somebody who knows what's going on and tell him what I saw. And so he does that, and he talks to the detective who ended up being the main person in charge on the scene. And he took his information, thanked him. It was all perfunctory and cordial. And that was it. 9 months later, the FBI did call him. He had an interview. By coincidence, quote unquote, his older Peugeot collector's automobile got its rear lights and its headlights smashed out by some weirdo with a crowbar. He didn't connect it to the FBI interview, but sure enough, after that FBI interview, no one contacted him again until they got a call from the London Daily Telegraph's Washington correspondent Ambrose Evans Pritchard, who said, hey, I've read your FBI interviews, and do you want to see them? He's like, well, sure. I didn't know I could, have access to them. Well, so he read them, and the FBI basically completely altered his testimony. They said he saw one kind of car when he testified to seeing a different kind of car. They said he couldn't pick out this sinister guy out of the lineup when he specifically said he could. He could definitely identify the guy. So Patrick Knowlton got very angry that his testimony had been altered. Then he was angry that, the authorities who have been on this case for nearly a year, didn't have any interest in his testimony that might overrule the idea that it was a suicide. And because of that London Telegraph interview, he finally got called by the grand jury the same day that article hit. And the grand jury was ignoring him. So the grand jury calls him to testify. And when that happens, like the day before, he and his girlfriend go on a walk, and 25, 30 different men start coming up and staring at him, walking by him, brushing by him, couple in a car driving by slowly. It was a very strange thing that was a destabilizing maneuver. And he had a couple reporter friends who, including Ambrose Evans Pritchard, who told him that it was an FBI surveillance net, and it was a known tactic that had been used during the civil rights movement and other places like that to destabilize a witness before he goes in and testifies. So this guy's getting harassed. He's getting his car bashed in. Pritchard ended up doing research on the guy who bashed in his car. Sheriff caught him, and the guy had top secret access, higher than top secret. It was highly classified, and he contracted with the FBI. So that was clearly related to his earlier testimony. So anyway, this guy, Patrick Knowlton, he's just a regular guy, but all of a sudden he finds himself in this strange situation, and he finds the kind of the highest levels of the federal government are harassing him in a really terrible way. Well, one thing leads to another, and he hooks up with a friend of his who's an attorney. They met doing laundry because they were both bachelors, and this guy was a criminal attorney and kind of had some guts and was kind of good, and he ends up filing a lawsuit against the FBI, civil rights lawsuit. And so all of a sudden he's got the power of discovery. And so he and the attorney and another researcher named Hugh Turley, who got into the mix, they all sort of the trio of guys just started going after the Vince Foster case and trying to crack it. And so it's a very long saga. It's very interesting. They come up with a lot of good information. Long story short, their case goes to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court won't hear it. But they did file a motion to have their 20-page report that basically contradicted all the facts that Ken Starr laid out in the Ken Starr report on the Vince Foster supposed suicide. They laid out all the facts that Ken Starr's report was basically erroneous and false. And the 3-judge panel who appointed Starr approved tacking on Knowlton's appendix to the end of the Starr report. So the official record now, basically, if you read it, it's very compelling that Vince Foster was not a suicide. Starr was very upset about it. He personally wrote a 9-page letter really pushing the judges not to allow Knowlton's report to be added to the official Starr report, but the judges overruled them. And so that's the permanent record. Now that's kind of a long story, and there's a lot more to it, and the book's very interesting. I tell it in a, kind of a interesting narrative. But the point there is that a citizen can make a difference. That's the third point of why this book is relevant, is that if, just a regular person like you and me and others out there, if we care about the truth and we want to spend some effort at it, we can make a difference.
Now, with this case, there are some, I guess, particulars with the evidence that strongly indicate that he did not die in Fort Marcy Park. Vince Foster did not die in Fort Marcy Park. If I recall, the original report had no mud on his shoes. They never found the slug that apparently that killed him. You mentioned how the weapon changed 3 times.
Right.
The way the body was laid out was sort of, I recall, it was kind of straight. The way he would have, if he had shot himself, the body would have fallen differently. And wasn't there also a witness that saw people running away from the scene?
Yeah, the first medic who came to the scene.
Yeah.
Was his name's Todd Hall, and he comes to the scene just as another guy gets there named Kevin Fornshill. Now, Fornshill was a park police officer who guarded the entrance to the CIA, and so he somehow, serendipitously has the good fortune to be the first guy to show up and be at the body, and so the medics are also responding to a 911 call, and they come over there. So this Todd Hall guy is the first guy to come over there. And as he's heading towards Fornshill, he sees some guy out in the woods and wearing some kind of orange vest running off. And he says to Fornshill, "Hey, there's somebody over there running away." And Fornshill just ignored him. So yeah, there was people observed running away from the corpse.
That's odd that a security guard for the CIA would be. I'm familiar with the area, and Fort Marcy Park is 2-3 miles away from Langley. Why would he happen to be at the park? Maybe, I don't know. Was that ever explained why he was that far away from the grounds of Langley?
I'd have to assume, and I don't know the answer to your question, but I'd have to assume that the CIA has another facility nearby.
Yeah, that could be the case. Also, they probably, this was 1993. This was almost 7 months after they had that shooting incident at the front gate, and maybe they were enhancing. They have a program where they drive around the area looking for things, maybe something like that. Yeah. So maybe that. Yeah.
Yeah, whether he was moved or not, or was killed there, I haven't spent a lot of time on that. But let's talk about the bullet wound in the head, because that's pretty interesting. So the official record, the official report, that claims suicide, and all the official reports said that he had a 1.25 inch hole in his head, which is a big hole. And so the official storyline is that he put the gun in his mouth, fired it, and it blew a big hole through his head. Well, the problem with that is that the 26 people on the scene, nobody saw a hole in the head. And several of them testify very adamantly that there was no hole in the head. The main detective gloved up and felt all over his head and found no hole. He said he found one mushy spot, but he didn't find any hole. And he was shocked when the coroner came back and said there was a 1.25 inch hole in his head. Now, several of the 26 people on the scene did see a small hole just below his jawline, which would make sense. Foster was tall. I think he was like 6'5". So it would make sense that someone smaller would, get up against him and put a gun, under his jaw and fire it and kill him. One of the medics who saw the hole described it as a low velocity, maybe like a 22 would have been fired there. And so the theory is that it went from the jawline through his head, and that's the mushy spot that the detective felt.
Yeah.
But the gun that was supposedly in his hand, if that gun had been fired in his mouth, it definitely would have had a huge blowout hole coming out the other side. That's why they had to have a big old hole in the official record. Well, where did that come from? That hole only comes from one person. His name's Dr. James Beyer. And Dr. James Beyer, in his autopsy, said that there was a 1.25 inch hole in the back of Foster's head. Well, here's the problem. He marks in his x-ray, in his coroner's report, that he took x-rays. But then when people want to see the x-rays, he comes back around and he says, well, I actually didn't take any x-rays. So a few months later, the Senate Banking Committee has one day of hearings on Whitewater, and they spend a little time on Vince Foster's death. And they bring up Beyer for some questioning. Most of the senators, as those hearings typically go, it was kind of political and there wasn't much going on. But there was one senator who was really bird dogging it well, Louch Faircloth from North Carolina. And so he brings up Dr. Beyer, Dr. James Beyer, and asks him, he says, okay, he says, you said in your report that you took x-rays, but then you say you didn't take x-rays. Did you or didn't you? And he says, well, I didn't take any x-rays. Well, he says, why did you mark that you took x-rays if you didn't? He says, well, I thought I was going to take x-rays, but we were having problems with our x-ray machine, so we ended up not taking x-rays. He says, well, why didn't you bring in an x-ray machine from, the nearby hospital or something? This is pretty big occasion here. What's going on? He says, well, we don't usually do x-rays, autopsies, unless it's, a gunshot wound or something. And, it's just really bad answers. And then Faircloth says, why, he says, we have a report here where the park police said that you told them you took an x-ray, and you told them the results of the x-ray, that the x-ray showed no bullet fragments. He says, how can the park police report that when you didn't take an x-ray? And he says, well, I don't remember them telling me that. He says, well, they definitely do. It's on the record. He says, well, I have no explanation then. Well, that's just a really, really scary interchange. And, but that's the only proof, alleged evidence that we have of this exit one. Well, let's talk about Dr. James Beyer. He also had on his record, and this is stuff that Knowlton and his team dug up as they started doing research on this guy. He had another case in his background where a young man was found with a gun in his hand, and he ruled that he had shot himself in the mouth and had come out the head and the whole thing, and ruled it a suicide. Well, the parents didn't believe it, and he said that there was no sign of a fight or anything, so they called for exhumation of the body, which showed all these defense wounds on the guy. He had abrasions on his chest. He had cuts on the back of his hands, all this kind of stuff that's classic defensive wounds. And then it turns out that he was a DEI informant. Anyway, it was just one bad thing after another. But his case got retried, and it was shown to be a murder. I forget who the murderer was. They found the murderer. I don't have that handy. Then there was another case where Beyer did the same thing. He declared a case to be a suicide, and the parents were upset again because they didn't believe it. But then the guy's girlfriend ended up confessing to the murder. So Beyer's got this long trail of declaring cases to be suicide that are actually murder. And it was this exchange that actually initially got me interested in this whole story, and I ended up writing the book 20 years later. But I saw this on TV when the hearings were going on. I actually taped it. I was incensed. I was furious, and I thought, well, surely this is going to be the big smoking gun, and it's all going to start coming out now. Well, nothing happened. I took it to our local paper. We got one of the few conservative papers we did back then in Chattanooga. Christian guy, Bible verses on the editorial page, all that kind of stuff, right-wing Republican, all that. So I showed him this interchange with the coroner and how dirty it obviously was, and he kind of nodded and smiled, and that was it. And I was just like, wow. And so it caused me to really start researching the whole thing and being very interested in it. But it wasn't until about 15 years later, 12 years later, that I found myself in the D.C., Baltimore area. I was living up there for a while, and I came across a friend who was a friend of Patrick Knowlton's sidekick, a guy named Hugh Turley. And I was like, I'd like to meet those guys. I've always been fascinated with their plight. And so I did, and I was in between gigs, and I needed to work on a good project. And so I spent several days with those guys. I learned all about their story. I got all their research and information. And so I decided to do a documentary on the whole Hillary and Vince story. And I wrote this treatment for the documentary, which ended up being this book. But I put 300 footnotes in there and everything. I wrote it like a book. I'm glad I did. But it was supposed to be a documentary, and that was in the early fall of 2007, as Hillary is about to become the nominee for the Democrats. And just as I wrote the thing and I was about to go raise money for the documentary, she suddenly plummeted in the polls, and some unknown guy that no one had ever heard of named Barack Obama all of a sudden just rose to the top and was just like, undoubtedly going to become the nominee. And once that was the case, I couldn't raise money for the documentary because it's like piling on. She's already out. So it just sat there for 8 years, and I had a friend about 3 months ago say, "You going to do something with that Hillary documentary?" And I was like, "Well, I don't know. It's been a long time." And I pulled out an old box out of the basement, dusted it off, and started reading the manuscript. And it was like, "Hey, this is good." And I read the next page, like, "Hey, this is really interesting." Now, yeah, I hope I footnoted this. Oh, yeah, there's some footnotes. Oh, good. And after I was done, I was like, I think we could turn this into a book. 8 years ago, we didn't have print on demand, Amazon ebooks, and all that kind of thing, and so it's a lot easier to get something out now. So Anyway, that's the history of how the book came about.
Now, if I recall, after Vince Foster's body was discovered, there was a rush to seal his office and control files. It was done by, I think it was Bernie Nussbaum, and I forget the other lady involved in it. But it was clear that the White House was covering something up. And, of course, you also have the testimony of people saying that Hillary had been in his office several times the week before his death, and she claimed she hadn't seen him for 6 months or something. So you had that conflict. And this type of inconsistency would I guess, mark Hillary Clinton as perhaps a suspect in his death, or at least being involved in it.
Yeah. Connecting Hillary to the last days of Vince Foster is a little bit tricky. She did call him 3 times, or 4 times through her, chief assistant, Maggie. Was it Maggie Williams?
I think it was Maggie Williams, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's on the record. And, she testified that she hadn't seen him at all a month, before he, killed himself. But another, White House staffer testified under oath that she was there at least 4 times, but she was out of town a week before he died. Mm-hmm. She was, the G7 in Japan, and then she was in Los Angeles, and then she was in Little Rock. And so she does have the alibi of not actually being there, although she was making phone calls to him via Maggie Williams. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's a bit of a labyrinth. But and we can get into all that.
Well, if it were some type of high level assassination that was ordered, obviously she wouldn't be the trigger man.
Exactly. Right.
Someone rid me of this meddlesome priest. That's how it works at that level. And, the word gets sent down. But of course, in your book, you detail that you seem to think that Hillary and Vince had a relationship, had an affair.
Right.
And so there's that. And I've heard that from other sources as well, that they were a couple for a while. And something happened where because some people say that she dressed him down or something, or made him depressed, and that contributed to his death or something. I've heard that to his quote suicide. That's one. Yeah,
and I looked at that here recently, the last few weeks, but then I've sort of been educated about that we need to stay away from that, because that's a couple of FBI officials who were associated with the case. One of them is kind of a known liar. Mm-hmm. It looks like it's just kind of potentially disinfo to make it look like a suicide, Hillary was mean to him and dressed him down, and that's why he killed himself. But Hillary, they talk about these meetings, but she wasn't really in town the week before, so there's that. Here's the connection between Hillary and the murder. First of all, here's the main connection, in my opinion, is that she was very close to him. She was his lover. They were best friends, all this kind of thing. And then clearly his death was covered up. He was murdered, and it's just clearly a cover up. You can't deny it after you do some research or you read my book or whatever. And so the question is, why, if Hillary was so close to him, has she not tried to find out what happened to Vince Foster? Why hasn't she tried to get him justice? Why did she let her close friend and lover just get offed and allow this cover up to take place? And that's the real question. I think, we can't really say she was the trigger person, like you say, and we don't even know that, Vince Foster was killed because of something related to the Clintons. That, it's likely, but he may have been involved in just some, high level drug running or some really weird stuff that wasn't quite related to the Clintons, but it was so bad that he got killed for it. Why wouldn't Hillary try to look into it?
Yeah.
That's really the question for me. That's the least harmful thing that you can say about Hillary in this situation, is that she didn't care that her best friend got killed and there was a huge cover up and she never did anything about it. That's the best. The worst is that she was actually involved in the killing.
Now, he apparently was at the White House that afternoon, and left, but there's no record of him signing out.
Yeah. There's targeted questions by the senators to the 2 FBI agents about that, and they would not say how they know Foster left at 1:15 because they didn't check the logs of the Secret Service guys that track the cars coming in and out of the White House. The FBI interview where Foster's wife talks about how Foster supposedly drove his 2 children to the White House that morning, part of that's redacted. So if basically that interview implies or indicates that Foster did drive into the White House parking lot, then that would create a real problem as to why we don't have a record of him leaving the White House. So, that's all part of it too. Let's talk a little bit about why he got killed. Can I move it to that?
Oh, sure, yeah, the motives. What if he was murdered, and there's a strong case to be made for that? Why?
Yeah, well, he talks about Nussbaum. Bernie Nussbaum was the chief White House counsel, and Vince Foster was deputy White House counsel. Well, they found in Nussbaum's safe a couple of manila envelopes sealed. One said Waco, and one said NSA. They were both put there by Foster's secretary. She testified that Foster had her put them into Nussbaum's safe. So in my book, the first theory I put out there, I don't think it's the best one, but it's just worth considering, is that he mentioned to several people that he was very concerned about Waco, and his wife said that it really tore him up to see those children die. Other people have run the phone logs of Hillary, Vince, and Hubble with Janet Reno and said that it's pretty clear that they were all very much advising her and instructing her and dealing with her throughout the whole thing, right up into the killing. And he was his secretary testified that he was working on a memo about Waco that morning. So that and the top secret folder that says Waco in the safe and some other things like that have caused some people to speculate that he knew some things about Waco and what really happened and what the military did that was unconstitutional and very dangerous, and that there were some people high up in that apparatus that didn't want him squealing about that, and perhaps his conscience was getting to him about what the military had done in that situation. So that's the first theory. The second theory has to do with Foster's connections to Mena, Arkansas. Most of your listeners are probably familiar with this, but part of the Iran-Contra affair that's completely documented but was never talked about on mainstream media is that while, yes, the U.S. military was taking weapons down to Central America and helping out the Nicaraguan Contras in that way, they were coming back on the planes or whatever they were bringing the weapons down there, and they were coming back with loads of cocaine, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cocaine that were being sold in America, and the money used to finance the black operations. And Vince Foster was involved in that. And we know that for a number of reasons, but Ambrose Evans Pritchard in his book details it a good bit and talks with the wife of a security guard for the Clintons who was running drugs back and forth from Mena and running money. And she saw the money. She talked to her husband about the drug running in Mena, and he told her that Vince Foster was the one who was setting it up. And Foster was involved in a lot of clandestine stuff like this. He was the Clinton person for Whitewater and all those kind of papers and that sort of thing. But anyway, if he was involved in that kind of high level drug running for the U.S. government, that could be part of, why, what was he saying? What was he doing? What was he about to blow the whistle on? Perhaps, I don't know. But another interesting fact is that Ken Starr, who did the final investigation on the Foster case, and of course worked very hard to make sure that it wasn't actually investigated. He actually has a background legally in setting up the legal framework so that operations like Mena and Iran-Contra could take place. In 1982, he was the chief assistant to Attorney General William French Smith, who drafted basically not legislation, but basically an agreement, a framework between with the CIA. At that time, the director was William Casey, and I've got letters going back and forth between those two where they basically set up a situation where intelligence officers, CIA, no longer had to report illicit drug activity that they were seen or were aware of. Before that, there was an obligation to report such things, but now in '82 that was taken away, which allowed them to just roll up their sleeves and get involved in something as terrible as MENA and not be held legally liable for it.
That's interesting. Ken Starr's involvement in that, because he was somehow involved in the facilitation and importation of illegal drugs into the country to fund this deep state operation, which anyone who's familiar with the CIA and clandestine services and its predecessor, the OSS, knows that's been going on for a very long time. But Ken Starr is a nephew of Cornelius Vander Starr, who was also known as C.V. Starr, who passed away in 1968. But he was an American businessman, he's also an OSS agent, and also founded the American International Group, AIG. His Starr company became AIG, and that was kind of known as the CIA's insurance company.
Amazing.
So these connections, it's kind of funny why he would be he would replace Fisk and just produce this limited hangout, the Starr Report, which would whitewash the Vince Foster death and also not look too far deeply into MENA, but focus on this Lewinsky scandal, which was salacious and got a lot of attention, but diverted attention away from a lot of other worse things that were going on during the Clinton administration and before, by the way, which might explain the cover-up, because MENA connects the Clintons to Iran-Contra, Oliver North, the Reagan-Bush administration. So you see the bipartisan nature of these scandals.
Right.
People don't know that the Bushes and Clintons are partners.
Yeah, was it Terry Reid, or I think it was Terry Reid who testifies that he was at a meeting at MENA that I think was attended by George H.W. and Bill Clinton and Ollie North. I think they're all kind of like in a bunker or something.
Yeah. And because he was one of these, these piss and vinegar patriotic people doing intelligence work until he saw what was really going on. A lot of these people who do this stuff are true believers. They're fighting the good cause, and they don't realize they're just pawns in this, this game of, elitist, New World Order CFR game of drugs, fomenting revolution, wars abroad, and just making the world a hellhole so they can profit off all the suffering. So
yeah, it's always hard to tell what little factoid is going to kind of push you over the edge or kind of get you to the next level. And one of the ones for me was, I can't remember where I read it, or maybe I heard it on one of your interviews or something, but the Skull and Bones way back when was involved in the opium trade in China.
Oh yeah, that goes back to the 1830s. That goes back to the establishment of the American elite.
That was just one of those factoids. For me, it's like, wow, this has been going on for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. I want to also mention real quickly, because this is really important part of the book and important for people to hear, and that's the story of the main prosecutor for Ken Starr in their Foster investigation. His name was Miguel Rodriguez, and he was hired. He was immediately hired when Ken Starr was appointed to investigate the Foster death. They found him in Sacramento. He had been involved in prosecuting gangsters and the mob and that sort of thing, and he was younger, Hispanic, obviously, and was kind of a left winger, wore a leather jacket on the weekends with an earring, and there was rumors that he was maybe a little soft, maybe even gay, but he was the kind of person that they like to appoint for these sort of things because maybe blackmailable, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
So he starts looking into the case, and but he starts doing a really good job, and he starts calling witnesses to the grand jury, and he starts uncovering this stuff, and he realizes that this thing's a murder. It's not a suicide, and he starts moving forward on it very, very swiftly. Well, he wrote a 30-page memo listing all the evidence and all the stuff we've talked about today. It's all basically in this 30-page memo. And he sends it to Starr, and basically when, Ken Starr is like a judge and he's like a chairman of a board way off somewhere, off, not hands on. And so he's got like a staff of 200. So he's not really hands on this stuff, but he's got a number 2 man, a number 3 man, who are kind of more hands on the situation. Well, when they find out that Rodriguez is really starting to crack the case, they freak out. And they start confronting him. They start threatening him. They start throwing chairs around in his office. And one of the guys, the number 2 guy in the Starr investigation, was a guy named Mark Tuohy. It's spelled Tuohey. He was a big Democrat, and he was absolutely terrorizing Rodriguez and telling him he could not proceed further. And and Tuohy wasn't just any old Democrat. He was married to Richard Daley's sister. And Mayor Richard J. Daley, the father, that was her father. Of course, his brother-in-law, Richard Daley, ended up becoming Obama's chief of staff in 2011. So this guy, very, very big Democrat. And so he absolutely just would not let Rodriguez proceed. And he started threatening him and this, that, and the other. And then he stopped the grand jury investigations. He wouldn't let Rodriguez call anybody else to the grand jury. And so in January of 95, Rodriguez resigned. In his resignation letter, he just basically said, I can't continue because I don't have the ability to crack the case. And so that's the story of Miguel Rodriguez. So the lead prosecutor, who wrote a 30-page memo outlining all the evidence, had to resign because he wouldn't come up with the answer that they were looking for.
Mm-hmm. That's how you squelch an investigation. And if no one backing you up, then you can do nothing about it. If Starr's not going to, discipline these people and let this go on, obviously you can stop an investigation. And of course, you mentioned with a staff of 200, I'm sure there's plenty of room in there for that staff to be infiltrated. I mean, if Garrison, who investigated the Kennedy assassination, had his staff infiltrated, and it turns out he did, I'm sure this staff is peppered with all types of informants and agents and mucking up the works,
Yeah. Now, so here's a more of a speculation thing, but just to try to figure out how bad this thing was that would cause such high levels. I mean, this is a murder that has been covered up from the highest levels. Why is it that big a deal? What is going on here? And I don't know that we really figured out what exactly it was that caused Vince Foster to be killed. Now, something very interesting that was found in the National Archives, Patrick Knowlton and Hugh Turley, on a regular basis, about every 6 months, they go down to the National Archives and they wade through thousands of documents and find stuff about the Vince Foster case. They've been doing it for 20 years. That's how we have this 30-page memo from Miguel Rodriguez. They found it in the National Archives about 10 years ago. But one of the things they found one day, which is the oddest thing, is they found this report, cover to a report that says child abduction. Report on child abduction related to the Vince Foster case. They're pretty sure that it got put in there by mistake. It looks to be the cover of a full report. The report wasn't put in there, just this cover. And so their sense is that it was stuck in there by mistake. Ken Starr has represented Epstein in the past, so you got that little. But we don't know what that's about. But I think it's an interesting little factoid because it does answer, how bad could it get that would cause someone as kind of, Vince Foster was he was no princess. He was a pretty dirty guy. He was involved in a lot of crappy Clinton dirt. So if he was killed because he was about to blow the whistle, it must have been something really bad.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the Epstein connection. He's representing Ken Starr, representing Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted billionaire pedophile who got off on, with a slap on the wrist with that plea deal with the Bush administration, by the way. That ties in Clinton, because Clinton's been connected to Epstein riding on his plane, the Lolita Express, and oddly enough, also Trump is connected to it.
He sure
Epstein.
is.
So might be why this is one of the scandals that Trump doesn't mention on the campaign trail, but also why the Republicans stay away from it. And just how these things work is they implicate both sides, and that's kind of how the system is controlled. But with Epstein, there's much evidence to suggest that is some sort of intelligence operation. And those who are in the know, or at least familiar with how these things go, is that sexual entrapment, honey traps, these things are ways that the intelligence agencies control the political process, how they neuter oversight. They compromise politicians and officials and corporate leaders, these sort of things. So this is why the intelligence agencies are often involved not only in drug trafficking but in human trafficking.
Yeah, let me read the cover of this title. I just emailed it to you while we're talking, but it's called "Questions for a Suicide Expert: Vincent Foster Death Investigation," and the title on the top says "Child Abduction and Serial Killer Unit."
Well, are you familiar with some of the research? Dave McGowan, of course, investigated the phenomenon of the serial killer, and he seemed to think that it was tied to military intelligence, going back to the Phoenix sort of a domestic application of the Phoenix operation.
Yeah.
And that some of these serial killers are sort of it's an adaptation or sort of variation of Murder Incorporated, where you can have someone pose as a serial killer, actually be a serial killer, but interspersed within those killings are targeted individuals. It's a way you can murder somebody and have it blend into the background, so to speak. I think the case of Henry Lucas in Texas, where he was he claimed to have killed thousands of people, was I think found guilty for dozens, but directly tied to hundreds. And he took the authorities on a grand tour of the burial sites of his victims. But he was, convicted serial killer in Texas, and he's the only person on death row to receive a commutation from George W. Bush, which is an odd choice for a commutation. His partner in crime, Otis Toole, who was believed to be involved in the Adam Walsh killing. I don't know if you remember that back in 1980. It was one of these early national incidents where a child was abducted and murdered. Of course, and he since confessed to the murder of Adam Walsh. He was a kind of a Henry Lucas's partner, and that killing had had satanic elements to it, decapitation, things like that. These things are thought to be one thing. It can be a Murder Incorporated thing. It also could be a strategy of tension.
Yeah, kind of like the mass shootings now.
Mass shootings, yeah.
Yeah, McGowan kind of argued that the serial killers phenomenon, which interestingly it kind of ended, kind of like the moon, moon landing suddenly, and the serial killers kind of sort of stopped.
Yeah,
and now we're into mass shootings on a regular basis.
And again, one thing is he ties into many of these serial killers have ties to the government. They get special treatment. There's inexplicable police incompetence to explain why they get away. But that's going down the rabbit hole. This is what you're saying. This is another explanation of why these cases why is it being squelched? Why is it being shut down? Because it's opening up a can of worms. Good example of that is also the Franklin case, where this guy Larry King, who operated the Franklin's credit union in Idaho, not Idaho. What's the
or Nebraska, wasn't it?
Nebraska. Sorry, yeah, Nebraska. Yeah, Nebraska was had people go get kids from the Boys Town home over there, and they would these children or younger, they were maybe tweens or teenagers, early teens. They would be kidnapped and they'd be sent around the country to service politicians and corporate leaders. And this goes back to the blackmail operation, because one of the places they went was to a mansion in Washington, D.C., run by a GOP lobbyist named Craig Spence, who was a noted homosexual. And he eventually committed suicide. when the investigation got hot. And the Washington Times did a story on this, the call boy ring being run through the White House. And it's supposed to be serious, and it got shut down. I think Paul Rodriguez was writing that story for the Washington Times. But what it does was, this was was a blackmail operation being operated out of D.C. And this another way that you control politicians. But another thing is, he ran a credit.
Remember that Page boy scandal?
Yeah.
About 15 years ago in Congress. You heard about it for about 2 or 3 days.
Yes.
It was all documented. It was all real. But for some reason, it just completely went away.
Goes away, yeah. These things just go away. And, well, another interesting dimension to the Franklin scandal was that, of course, the bank that he ran, apparently $40 million went missing. This was a very large sum of money for a small operation. This gets into the savings and loans and how they were utilized by the mob and the intelligence agencies. They were raided to pay for black operations and criminal operations, drug running. And it's almost like many of these savings loans, they went up. There were miniature BCCIs all over the country. And this involves the Bush administration, the first George H.W. Bush administration, who orchestrated the bailout then. And of course, it was George Bush's son, Neil Bush, who ran the Silverado savings loan, went belly up. And, a bunch of bad sweetheart loans to people. And if you get into, I think it's Peter Bruton's book, CIA, the Mafia, and George Bush, gets into how these banks are being utilized by organized crime and intelligence operations to fund criminal operations, drug running, and black ops, because they're all in bed together. And again, this branches out into like owners of sports franchises, and corporate leaders, and all that stuff. And again, this explains why no one can afford to really look into these things, because if you really do an honest investigation, you uncover all sorts of crimes being involved, whether it's human trafficking, drug running, financial fraud, and it's all related. So.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And, that high level of evil is hard for most of us to comprehend. But back to my original point, when that is that if something related to what this document says, child abduction and serial killer unit, if that is related to the foster death, foster murder, that would make some sense. Financial fraud, I don't think someone's going to necessarily get killed for that. Maybe they would be. Or I don't think someone's going to speak out about that. Let's put it that way. But would they speak out about human trafficking and child abduction? Well, they might.
Well, are you familiar with the FBI agent Gunderson?
No.
He did an investigation on the McMartin child abuse scandal in California, and he was a former FBI agent. Now, there's some people question his.
The Gunderson guy who gave the lectures.
Yeah.
And all this stuff. Yeah, I've seen that once or twice.
And one of the things he investigated was the Finders case. The Finders case was that there's a kind of this cult that was discovered down in Florida. They were trafficking in these young kids. Their kids were found in a van down, I think it was in Florida, if my memory serves me correct. And of course, local authorities investigated. This is why we know what went on, because local authorities initially investigated this and did their job. They traced it all the way up into D.C., into a warehouse in D.C., where they had like international. This is the late 80s or early 90s, so they were like international fax machines and connections and all that. There were these kids were being marketed globally. The authorities were investigating, and the investigation was shut down by the Justice Department by the request of the CIA as a national security concern.
Yeah.
So it may give you some hint of what was going on there.
Right.
It goes back to this is one of these things where it's all part of the drug running, the illegal arms deals, the civil wars, and the human trafficking. It's all related. So the moment you investigate, the moment you start pulling on a thread, it starts to come undone, and someone has to stop it. And if that involves shooting a deputy counsel, at the White House, that might be an action that someone's willing to do to just snuff it out, stop it, send a message or something.
Right.
It's speculation, but I think it's warranted speculation. So.
Well, a couple other things I wanted to mention to you that you might find interesting. Do you know who the one of the main witnesses was in the White House counsel's office that gives us a lot of the information of what happened the day of Foster's death, and was also the person who told us that Kathleen Willey got sexually assaulted by Bill Clinton.
Linda Tripp.
Linda Tripp. She's in three places. she's in the White House counsel's office the day of Vince Foster's death as a secretary. Then she's working in the White House when Kathleen Willey gets sexually assaulted, and she's the reason we know about it because she told the press. And then she moves to the Pentagon and finds herself right next to wouldn't you know it, a girl named Monica Lewinsky. So she's a real interesting character. To me, there's a possibility that she's kind of working for somebody besides just a gal trying to make a living.
Well, that Lewinsky thing, I think you could make the case that that is a diversion that was created at some level to get away from the larger scandals like MENA, Arkansas, and the Arkansas Development Finance Agency, which was involved in laundering much of the drug funds coming into Arkansas. And this is where the Arkansas officials got to wet their beaks a little bit. That's how you got them into the action. But Monica Lewinsky, there's a interesting intelligence operation that's run by the Israeli government. It's called Helpers or SANMs. And apparently they claim, at least there was Victor Ostrovsky who wrote the book Other Side of Deception. He claims that there are roughly 1 million of these helpers around the world, part of the diaspora, that do intel support, financial support. They work within agencies, corporations, wherever, to support Israeli foreign policy objectives or intelligence operations. And there is some evidence to suggest that Rahm Emanuel, who is also is Jewish and also was a member of the Israeli Defense Force, although I suspect he's probably an intelligence operative like his father, put Lewinsky in the White House. And what the suggestion here is that when you put someone like Lewinsky in the White House near someone like Bill Clinton, the Mossad would have a personality profile on Bill Clinton. And it's very easy to predict what was going to happen.
Right. Yeah.
And apparently there was a report that when Clinton met Netanyahu in Rye River in like 1998, 1999, that he said to Clinton that we had tapes of you talking to Lewinsky on the phone. But don't worry, we got rid of it, which, that's an obvious threat.
Right.
J. Edgar Hoover used to issue the same threats to people in Washington, D.C., Don't worry, it's secure with us, so don't worry, we'll never blackmail you. Wink, wink, nod, nod.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that there's evidence to suggest that perhaps Lewinsky was set on Clinton to compromise him, and at some level, when the scandal broke, maybe someone saw the opportunity to divert it to this salacious sex scandal and get the Whitewater investigation away from where the real sexy stuff was, which is drug running and murder in Arkansas.
Yeah, one of the lines that caused me to give more entertainment to your theory there. I sort of believe your theory, but if you remember at kind of the very end of the whole narrative, they interview Monica Lewinsky and the very last thing she says, oh, and one more thing, I hate Linda Tripp. And that sounded so canned and scripted to me. And I just thought, that's really weird, but they really want to kind of really make sure that everybody knows that they hate each other and that this was all just, came out because of that. But it really, I think there's a real strong evidence for collusion.
What's odd there is that the whole story behind her going to the Pentagon was the White House wanted to get her away from Bill Clinton, and over at the Pentagon, and they sit her right next to Linda Tripp, who's already testified in these cases. Bill Clinton isn't making that decision; someone else is making that decision. Well, and whoever's making that decision could also be an asset who's working to either undermine Clinton at one level, at the same time save him because he's involved in so many horrible things.
Aussie Skateboard, and you're listening to UC Live.